here will just be done for you. So, anybody willing to volunteer to help us take notes? We do need a scribe. It's easy. You can even get some help from other people potentially. Chris Lemons, you are very welcome, and thank you for the offer. And don't forget to record your own name as the note taker in the Etherpad. All right, well, we have a scribe, and I'm assuming that people can watch and bring their own issues up from Jabber. We don't need a Jabber scribe, so. If somebody would like to monitor Jabber, though, feel free to do so and raise your hand when we get to the discussion section. So we have a pretty full session today. Let me just go ahead. First of all, I want to make everybody aware that note well does apply. This is an official IETF meeting, so please read and familiarize yourself with the rules around contributions to IETF documents and the IETF in general. These are your two co-chairs. I'm Glenn Dean, and your other co-chair is David Lawrence. David, I don't think that photograph is quite accurate anymore, hair-wise.
No, it's been a year, hasn't it, everybody?
I was like you until about 2 weeks ago, then I finally got the chop. So there is a future at barbershop, so you never know. We have a pretty packed agenda today. We're in the first 5 minutes here. We've done our Jabber scribe, we've done our note well. This is the agenda today. We'll have two sessions this week. The first one is a 1-hour session today, where we're going to attempt to cover 2 of the drafts that the working group has adopted. And then on Thursday, we have a second session on March 11th. And that's a 2-hour session, which will allow us for even more extended discussion. The format for today's session, and I'll call for agenda bashing in a second, is a little bit different than we've used in the past. So ADD's always thrived really well when given the opportunity to discuss things, and has really rejected the idea of being sort of a passive listener for an extended period of time. So what we've done now with these 2 adopted working group drafts is ask the editors, the authors, to pull out the issues that they need to raise to the group and to discuss, and to make those be the slides that get presented out. And so the format we're going to follow today is a very interactive one, where at each slide, issue discussion will be presented, and we will open up the mic line for people to make comments on that issue and try to capture them. And then once that's done in a reasonable amount of time, we'll move on to the next slide and the next set of issues. So hopefully that works out really well, and hopefully we have enough time today to cover all this. If we can't cover all of this, we'll roll whatever's remaining from today into the beginning of the Thursday session. So with all that said, does anybody have an agenda bash or issues that they want to bring up? Okay, perfect. Moving on. The first draft up we have here is the working group draft IETF ADD DDR, Dance Revolution, followed by Dolby Noise recording later on. We got to get better names, I think, sometimes. Anyhow, who's presenting for DDR? Is it Tommy Polly?
Tommy Jensen.
Tommy Jensen. Okay. Sorry, Tommy Polly had sent me I thought, or maybe it's Tommy's in plural. My apologies for getting you confused. It's so much easier when we can see real people. Okay, Tommy Jensen, the floor is yours. And then after you do a slide and you're ready to take questions, Teo will manage the queue.
Thank you. So today we're going, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I got a toast from Meet Echo saying I couldn't be heard, so this is good news. So we're going to cover the open issues on the DDR draft. Next slide. Issues 2 and 5 cover the use of address hints, as listed there. Our plans to address these are to revise the document to point out that resolvers should include the hints and that clients should use the IP address hints until there are a quad A values. This is in regards to the SVCB draft, which points out that hints are only to be used until the names can be resolved. Connections using those hints should or must meet the same cert requirements, meaning that the DDR process for confirming that the cert name covers the referring IP address still applies. Chairs, I don't know, do you want to go through the slides and then do questions, or do questions?
I think let's address them as little bite-sized morsels this time. So Ben Schwartz is ready to comment.
Hi. So for IP hints, why do we need any why do we need any special text here?
Right now, the draft doesn't indicate, or rather the draft just says that the process stops there. And the issue is that a compliant SVBC client needs to continue on. You could say that just referring to the draft covers that.
So what I mean is, why are we even discussing hints in this? Apart from saying these keys are allowed.
The idea is that a resolver should provide them to speed the process up, because otherwise there's an additional round trip to resolve the name, which itself, if the client has no encrypted DNS connection yet, is subject to attack.
Okay. I think we should give that a little more thought. In particular, I think that's only true if target name is non-empty.
Fair.
Or rather non-default.
Noted. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Ben. We can go to the next slide. Well, last call. Any other issues here to comment? Okay, thank you. Glenn, yep.
So issues 3 and 4 are regarding the security considerations. One being concern around the use of a private IP address as a security mechanism. We need to clarify that that's not the case. The private IP address identification is conducted only to decide when to enforce same address use, meaning that if a private IP address is advertised, then we're in an opportunistic mode, meaning that we should only connect if we are connecting to the same IP address and we can skip the name certification check. This is because in this mode, we don't have an option for strong authentication. And so we want to make sure we don't worsen our current situation, which means that we will only send encrypted traffic to the same IP address that we would have to send unencrypted traffic in the event of no bootstrapping at all. And then for the other issue, clarifying that the target name is required for a proper HTTPS connection, making sure that the DOE bootstrap is has the same security features as any other HTTPS connection. And then the referring IP address is required for validating the insecure bootstrap so that the client knows that the referral was agreed upon by both parties. Next slide, please. Or questions.
Yep. Any feedback here? I'm just double checking chat. Sometimes I'll, like Eric on the previous slide had a question that probably would have been good to just bring up to everybody, but it looks like we can move on for this slide. Oh, Ben's back.
So, sorry, could you, for issue number 4, I thought we had consensus that we don't need multiple name checks on a single certificate.
So the need for both of these is laid out. Is this something you disagree with? I don't recall the consensus you're referring to.
Okay, yes. I disagree with this.
Okay.
I guess this isn't surprising because I proposed a substantial revision to this draft a while back that, among other things, changes this behavior. So I guess we'll have time to talk about that.
Okay.
We could talk about it a little more right now.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, I mean, yeah, Ben's back. I see you there, Ecker. Let's let Ben finish up his.
Overall, so I'll just say I think this. Overall, I think the draft contains some incorrect analysis about where the trust anchors are in this system, about what sources of information are trusted identifiers and which ones aren't, about which ones need to be in certificates and which ones don't, and as a result, I think comes to an incorrect conclusion about how to deal with the question of cross IP upgrade. I don't think that this changes the fundamental structure of the draft. I think that this can be dealt with as an update, but there are some substantial revisions that I want to this draft.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Ecker, please, unless Glenn has a priority interrupt.
Oh, I didn't need to be a priority interrupt. I just don't want to be in the queue. I guess my understanding of the reasoning here is I start and I want to ask. I mean, so like, let's take a step back from this case and look at the general case. So like I start on the HTTPS and I get a service B record that says you might want to go over here. And that's effectively a CNAME. And then when I go over there, I expect to see the same certificate identity that I initially typed in, right? Or initially dereferencing. And so I think the question, and so similarly, the requirement in this case, the minimum requirement is the certificate has to contain the name that I started with. And then the question is, does it also need to contain a name that is different from the name I started with? And I'm not aware of a security reason why it needs to be. So I think, Ben, is that the issue you're raising? Or or is it a different issue that you're raising?
I'm not sure that I can summarize this all in a nutshell here, except to say we just need to be very clear about which pieces of information are our starting points, and this draft has a few different modes. Essentially, I think in each mode, we just need to be very clear about what is our initial identifier, the thing that we're holding onto that tells us what the resolver is, and then that's the only thing that we need to be checking.
Right. I mean, the reason the situation as I understand it is that I started with like I'm an example.com and I started being told I should be going to ns.example.com, right? And I don't trust any information I receive allegedly from ns.example.com over to 53. And so then the minimum requirement is that when I connect to the thing I finally connect to, it better still be at ns.example.com or be able to demonstrate it. So I think that's the reasoning you end up with in this case. But yeah, I think it's right. Ben's right. I have to lay out in each case what the chain of security reasoning is that gets us to the point of being okay. I don't necessarily mind it having both names, but I don't think it has to have their referring IP address.
Thank you, Ecker and Ben. Glenn, please.
Hey, so Ben, I think you're bringing up some really good considerations here, and I'm wondering if maybe it would be useful, both for the discussion right now, but for people looking back at this discussion from the future, trying to understand the decisions we made and why. If you could maybe try to capture some of that thinking of the order of these things and what we need to be actually properly using for the establishment, and then maybe a few words on what we should be using for the establishment, and either capture them in this document or even as a separate document, because I think it's a really valuable conversation to have. And if the people that are so deeply enmeshed in it right now are sort of bouncing around a little bit on this, maybe capturing that would be a very valuable thing to help the group understand better, but also I'm thinking long-term for people looking back and understand why we made the choices we did make. So I'm trying to give you some work, Ben.
Thank you, Glenn. Tommy Pauly, please.
Hello. Yeah, so I think we definitely should iterate on this and clarify things. To give a concrete example, and maybe Ben or Eric, if you want to comment on this, the thing I'm thinking of in my head is, let's say that the thing I start with is that the user typed in 1.1.1.1 as their preferred DNS server. And so that's the only thing I know to start with. So I'm going to, if for some reason that's going to point me somewhere else, I want to validate. So let's say it points me to a v6 address that actually serves quad 1. I want to validate that you can cover the original address I started with. But also, if I'm doing DO here, and you've told me, hey, yeah, you're doing HTTPS, you have this authority, you have the name that you're actually having to ask for, cloudflare-dns.com, and a given path, it would seem very odd to tell the client, no, do not check that the HTTP server's TLS server that you're going to has the correct name in the authority that you're using in your HTTP request. So I think the logic here is that you cover the IP address because that's the original identifier you started with. But if you are going forward and making HTTP requests with an authority that's a different name, or doing further SVCB lookups to find other properties off of the DNS SVCB record based on that name, not the address, you would want to make sure that you have a legitimate name.
Thank you. Ben Kaduk, please.
Wow, Tommy is a tough act to follow, but I think I wanted to try and sort of reframe the same topics that Ben and Eric were covering in terms of sort of the standard RC 6125 certificate validation procedures. So like in general, when you're doing TLS, you start out making some sort of connection and you have some identifier for the server you're trying to contact. And so you have your initial identifier for the thing you're trying to contact, and you do TLS, and the server gives you a certificate. And now you have to ask, do I trust this certificate for the name I'm trying to contact? And that's just an overall general thing. And so in this case, like the initial name you're trying to contact would be the IP address, as I think both Ben and Ecker said. And you can possibly try and say that the IP address is going to be the authority for what you're doing in the HTTP sense, but that's not a great fit. And what Tommy Pauly said makes some amount of sense. But I think that coming at this from the model that 6125 uses in terms of, I have a connection and I need to authenticate that connection against the initial identifier I used to start making that connection is going to be pretty valuable here. And if we want to maybe also do other stuff in addition to that, that might be okay. But I think we need to keep in mind the core fundamental model of authenticate the initial connection I tried to make.
Thank you, Ben. And in a novel approach, Tommy has joined the queue for himself.
Well, I didn't know, I didn't want to go interrupting people, so I thought I'd follow the same model as everyone else. To highlight what Tommy said, and especially in the comments context, there are two pieces of identity required because there are actually two different identities being confirmed. A more interesting case that points this out is one where the initial DNS server IP address and the referred DO server IP address are different. So if I reach out to a resolver that has IP address 1234 over plain text DNS, and it gives back a service record that says you should connect to DO template.example at IP address 5678. I need to make sure that the TLS certificate can claim both DO server.example for all the reasons already described. That's the identity of the server I'm trying to connect to. That information alone establishes the identity of the destination resolver. But the other thing that I'm trying to confirm is that this resolver was expecting what is that 1234 and do server.example are cooperating, and that I wasn't hijacked to a attacker's do server. And so I'm checking for 1234 within the certificate to ensure that the destination also controls the original person that I was talking with. And so there's two different things we're trying to confirm, which is why there are two different pieces of information included.
Thank you, Tommy. And unfortunately, that window, as I had to silence, that was my notification. I went, okay, I'm back. Eric.
Right. So I think we had a bunch of discussion in the Jabber. So maybe like it will help people sort of this analogy. I think there are two ways to think about this this indicator, this SVCP indicator. One is like a CNAME, and the other is like a 302. And in a CNAME, what you do when you get to the other side is you expect the authority and you expect the certificate to match the original thing you started with. And at 302, what you expect is to connect to the thing and get like an authoritative like indication for the original person you're talking to, and then get bounced somewhere else, and then you expect to talk to that person authoritatively. And so like this isn't like not a perfect model fit for either of these because like it's all jumbled in one thing. But if your mental model it's like a CNAME, then you're like, hey, I only need the first thing. If your mental model is a 302, then you need both. And I think that and one of the things that came up in this issue is if you're doing dot, this is like somewhat less clear, but if you're doing do, is like, is what are you shoving in the host header and what are you, when you do the query, and is it the original IP address or whatever you configured with, or is it the thing that was stuffed in the SVCP record? And I agree with Tommy that if it's the second, then it is really goofy to be like, sorry, if you started with 1.1.1 and then it got bounced you to cloudflare.dns.com, and that's what you're putting in like the host header and the URL, then it's like super goofy to not check the certificate for that. That seems like it'd be unfortunate. So I think maybe that's the way to think about it rather than a certificate issue.
Thank you, Ecker. Ben Schwartz, please.
So I think we have consensus that in this context, we do need the IP address in the certificate. The reason why, I think the core reason why I don't want us to have to put an additional name also in the certificate is that first of all, it doesn't provide an additional security property, really, at least not if you actually trust that IP addresses in certificates mean I control this IP address. But secondly, it breaks the HTTP abstraction barrier. If the only thing that's needed is to put the IP address in the certificate, then we have a relatively straightforward way to pass this information across to an HTTP stack and say, here's the URL that you're supposed to connect to. And here's a URL. It contains an authority component. That's the name that you're checking for in the certificate. If we start requiring multiple names, then it gets very confusing. It no longer is something that you can easily plug into a stock HTTPS client stack. And I do think that there is a close analogy here to the way that we use CDNs generally. We do not ask clients to, when they follow a CNAME record in the DNS, we do not ask clients to validate that the destination contains both the name of the authority and the name of the CDN. Even though they do know both of those names, they could double check. And it would probably work most of the time, but there's no requirement that it be set up that way.
Thank you, Ben. DKG.
So following on to Ben's point there about can we just pass this information to a stock HTTP stack, I am not convinced that we have great IP address cert checking in all the stock HTTP stacks themselves. So there's already a question about compatibility there. But I actually do agree with Ben's point that asking a stock HTTP stack to check multiple names in the course of a single connection is a really unusual requirement. And so I would want to ask, what do we think the specific gain is from having to check both of those things? For the folks who would advocate for checking both of those things, what does the system as a whole, or the client, or the server gain from having both checks in place? Like, what is the specific thing that's being gained there? I think that might be clarifying, just to hear a specific answer to that.
Thank you. Tommy Pauly, please.
All right. So I definitely hear the point that if we have an IP address in the server, that would be sufficient. I think if that is the case and that's all you are validating, I think we would want to say that for the case of DOE and everything else, you would have to treat the authority for HTTP purposes as the IP address, and that's definitely acceptable. I think perhaps we could go with the solution of saying, yeah, from the DDR perspective, the only thing you absolutely need is the IP address, but then have an addendum that says, if you want to use an authority that is the name that you learned, then you must also validate that before using that name as an authority or using it for future operations. For a very simple case in which there's a pretty one-to-one mapping between these things, it doesn't matter. I could imagine a case in which perhaps we have different names, essentially like different SNIs that are hosted on the same address that do have different meanings to a particular client. Let's say the stack has a list, like some stacks do. I think Firefox and Microsoft currently do, of names of resolvers that they have preference for or that they already know they trust. If I saw an address that said, oh yes, I actually am designating over to one of these names that you already do trust, then we could in that case validate the address and then validate the name if we prefer for some system reason to use that name. You don't have to, but if you want to use the name, then you should kind of do the standard validation that you would for the authority.
Thank you, Tommy. Eric Worth, please.
Yeah, Tommy actually just made most of the point I was about to make myself. But yeah, a lot of these cases where the one case where I can think of where it would be useful to clients to have this name is if the clients want to, say, refer to a whitelist of names they're willing to upgrade to and such. They need to be able to make sure this is the thing that matches our whitelist. For the most part, this doesn't seem like it applies to the general case. For the most part, if you want to use a whitelist of known things, well, then you can also use your same whitelist for auto upgrade like a lot of clients are doing today. So that's kind of like, why would you be using DDR if you want to do that? But I could kind of imagine there might be cases where clients might optionally want to do checks like that. So in the very least, I think it's very reasonable to say optionally clients should be able to check against the target name as well. But I don't think it needs to be a must, because the core thing that most clients are going to want to check against, I think we get all the security properties we need just from the IP address.
Thank you. Ralph is currently the last one in the queue, and so let's please wrap up this discussion so we can move on to the next. It's been a great conversation, but Ralph Faber, please.
Yeah, so I agree that we should use kind of one thing as the trust anchor to have. And there is also a section in there when we are coming from a name that I think is ambiguous. There is section 5 where we say if there are sort of two targets, we'll check sort of the source and the destination. I think we should have the same stuff there. I mean, just use, if we are starting with a name, use the initial name as the kind of name you're checking. And if you're starting with an IP, use the initial IP as the stuff you're checking with. all.
Okay, thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everyone. That was pretty helpful. So I will update the issue with the discussion, but we need to move forward. So we'll take the rest to list in GitHub. Issues number 6 and 7 deal with the special use domain name and forwarders. This is pretty straightforward. We plan to revise the document to highlight that resolvers should only ever answer queries for themselves and otherwise should always return NX domain. There is an asterisk there for the special case where you may have a 100% blind forwarder, and one may choose to forward the SVCB record from upstream, but we'll include verbiage that calls out the implementer should be aware that this will likely result in client authentication failure unless the certificate can claim the IP address of the blind forwarder as well.
Ben, please.
So this is a fundamental scope question. I think that this really is of general interest to the ADD group, because the question is, do we want to try to enable encrypted DNS? Or do we want to try to at least make it possible for clients to do encrypted DNS through legacy customer equipment? So if I'm at home, as I am now, with a forwarder on my Wi-Fi access point that's pointed to my ISP's resolver, can I get, and it doesn't do anything, all it does is forward queries and forward responses. Can I or can I not get an encrypted DNS connection to my ISP without having to replace my access point? I know there are a lot of people in this working group who believe that that's an important use case that they want to enable. I've heard a lot of demand for that. And we need to be really clear that the draft currently does not enable that use case. It does not support upgrade in that case. I believe that it is possible for us to enable a secure upgrade mechanism in that case, and I've written the text as a suggestion to the authors of how that would be laid out. But ultimately, it's up to the working group to decide whether we want to include that in the scope of this draft.
Thank you, Ben.
So I believe we'll touch on this in the next slide, i.e. the scope of the draft. Agreed that the issue definitely exists, and I will say it is important. As written, as you say, that scenario is out of scope because right now we don't see a path forward that would allow that to be secured. Having said that, I know you and others feel differently, and so that's a point of discussion. But right now, we should definitely clarify until future text is added that scenario is specifically out of scope.
Next slide, please.
So the final pair of issues on GitHub are 8 and 9, which talk about document scope. We should specify when local forwarders represent upstream resolvers, and why is the special use name necessary for opportunistic scenarios. So the clarifications we're proposing in the document are local forwarders designating upstream resolvers is out of scope, asterisk, unless the recommended DOE resolver can in fact claim the identity of the local forwarder. But the point is the everyday scenario here, that can't be true because the local forwarder is a local IP address. The need for resolver metadata in the opportunistic case. The reason we need the special use domain name is so that we can retrieve things like, do you use a non-default port number, the name to be used in the cert checking, although that references the issue we were discussing earlier that perhaps that's not a must and more of a should. But those are the reasons we require it. And that's the last slide, so.
Okay, Eric Orth, if you'd like to comment, please.
Sort of continuing the discussion of Ben's argument, talking about his previous proposal. I don't remember exactly what the proposal was, but I kind of recall that, yeah, it's sort of in the gray area of it's might be okay for some clients' desires for security properties and not for others. And obviously, again, I don't remember the exact proposal that well, so this might be something to examine further. But I think maybe we should make it the case that we just call it out as optional whether or not a client wants to support that, and have it in the draft, because it is an important area to solve if we can solve. And maybe it's the case that a lot of clients will say, no, security is not good enough for that now, but later on down the line, without any actual changes needed to the draft, but just changes to the ecosystem, and as far as the prevalence of legacy routers, maybe clients will be more willing to do it then. I don't know. So I think it is something we should consider, making it something optional to support. Just saying whether or not a client does support it is a policy question that is out of scope for us to answer for them, but it's there as an option.
Thank you, Eric. And with this, Tommy has come to the end of his set. If anybody wants some final comments here, I think we're going to move on to the next. And also, actually, in the interim here, thank you, Tommy. Daniel and Ben do have a couple of comments before we move on. And one of the things also, could you mention, by the way, just as we hope that this has been effective, rather than, for this specific issue of dealing with issues about, focusing conversation on each issue as we go. But if you feel that this, for some reason, has not been effective, we'd like to hear it. So thank you. Daniel.
So I had a question regarding the use of a special domain. Since those domains are breaking DNSSEC or cannot be protected with DNSSEC, I'm wondering if we could use just a standard name that is part of the DNS hierarchy. And I was thinking of using, for example, something a domain name that is built from the IP address. So it could be the IP address.alpa. I just like we try to address that that aspect also.
So this is.
Sorry, please go on, Tommy.
Sure. So this is an interesting proposal. Let the other authors speak for themselves. My position on this is that the existing proposal is likely to have better adoption, given the rollout of DNSSEC compared to the reliance on PKI, in a nutshell. But certainly what you're proposing is possible. It's something we should discuss. We'd welcome an issue on GitHub.
Okay. Do you want me to raise the issue on GitHub or? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Daniel. And I will note, by the way, that we are about almost 2/3 into our session here. So if Ben and Ecker could be quick in their comments.
Okay. On the reverse zone note, I'll just say I think that tends to indicate, it tends to be associated with AS ownership of an IP address, which isn't exactly the same thing as operational, I have a box at this IP address. So I think that the semantic doesn't quite match. On the general forwarder question, I'll just float to the working group that if we, another alternative to consider is to try to split this into a separate draft. Let's say this draft scope is restricted to the same IP case, and make sure that it doesn't put up any roadblocks, and then add a second draft that talks about essentially forwarder bypass.
Great, thank you, Ben. And Ecker has chosen to save his comments for later, I suppose. So we are on to the next set.
All right, so who is speaking to this draft?
Yep. Yeah, go ahead, Mohammed. You can buzz yourself in.
Yeah, thank you again.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, so this will be I would say an update of the DNR draft to give you the I would say an update of the current status and the open issues we have so far. So if you can move to the next slide, please.
Sure, and Mohammed, let me make one comment. If we don't get through all of your issues in this thing, so don't rush. We'll move them and carry on where we left off on the Thursday session, okay? So don't rush yourself, take the time you need. Okay,
fine. Yeah, so in this slide, we are just, I would say, providing the pointer where we are tracking the issues. We have currently 3 open there. 2 of them were raised during the call for adoption. So we didn't reply to that to the I would say to discussion on the mailing list because we didn't want it to interfere with the call for adoption for itself and to bring more technical discussion on it. But we didn't close that, and this is stored on the I would say on the tracker itself. In this presentation, we'll focus on one of the I would say on the issues that I would say triggered more discussion on the list. It was I would say a comment from Ben. It's basically to say that we need to largely rewrite the document so that we harmonize with what the DDR are doing. So in the next slide, we will explain in order to assess I would say this issue, we need first to understand what is the information that we are discovering in the DNR specification, so that to be sure if there is really something that to be rewritten or if that is true. So as you can see in these slides, it's really the information that we are discovering here are really minimal. That means that we are not discovering a lot of information, only the required information to establish a connection with a server. And that information is an authentication domain name and also a list of IP addresses. The list of IP addresses and an alternate port number are really important because we, as we explained in the next slide, we need to avoid, I would say, probing, and also we need to avoid falling into to the legacy DNS, because otherwise we will be inducing other security constraints into the proposal, and we want to master and to control the information that we will convey directly using the DHCP and the DRR option. Next slide,
Thank you.
please.
What? No. Ecker has a comment right on this, please.
So I don't understand what, like, when we discussed adoption of this draft, I think there's pretty strong consensus that we should not attempt to reinvent the information model. Why aren't you just basically putting in an SVCP record? I mean, I'm sure how to encode it in some different fashion, but like the same information is what you need. So why don't we simply define a common piece of information and shove it in both places?
Would you like to address that now, Mohammed?
Can you just repeat your question, Eric, please?
Sure. So it seems to me that the information you need here is that more or less the same information as in DDR. And so what you ought to be doing is taking the same information model, the SVCB record, or perhaps potentially re-encoded, and shove it in here. Yeah, that's one option to do. But for instance, if you refer to the DDR, you need, for instance, a name in order to, I would say, to ignite all the discovery process. And here in the specification, we are providing a means to provide this name. So that's why we have, I would say, an option to convey to you a name so that you can ignite your discovery process. Right, but so I'm saying don't do that. I'm saying shove the information in there directly.
Okay,
I'm not sure to get your point.
Okay, let's go back to the previous slide, please. So, like, let's take a look at this at the right-hand side, where you have like some addresses and you have a port number and you have some flags. Like, this is sort of vaguely like what SVCB and DDR have, but not exactly. So, like, have exactly that. Have exactly the information that is in SVCB for DDR, including like with whether it's do or dot, including like the URL pattern, the whole thing.
Yeah, that's true for the, I would say, for the list of IP addresses and for the port number. And this is what I was explaining in the, I would say, on the next slide, in which we in a previous version of this specification we had only the name, the authentication address name, and that authentication address name you can use directly, I would say, the SVCB in order to return the list of your IP addresses and the alternate port number. That's something
But
that can be.
But there's more stuff in SVCB than the IP address and the port number.
Yes, I know, and this is an issue that we will discuss, I would say, in one of the slides here in the presentation. Here I am just explaining why we are just restricting ourselves to the minimal set of the information that needs to establish the connection. We are not here.
I'm saying don't do that.
Yeah.
I know, but I'm disagreeing with that decision. I'm saying, like, let us not try to reinvent this. Let us do exactly the same thing we did for DDR.
Okay, I think that's a very valuable feedback and should be raised as an issue for ending up for further investigation. But for the moment, it seems like you two have exchanged the idea, so we'll move on.
Yes, so as I mentioned earlier, so once you discover your name and I would say the list of IP addresses and the internet port number, then you can use, I would say, what is defined in the DDR document in order to retrieve additional information from I would say from the server. Next slide, please. So the question we have, once we have that in mind, it's what additional information we need to, I would say, to convey in the option, and if do we really need to convey additional information so that we harmonize with the DR.
Ben Schwartz, please.
Hi. So my preference here would be to just provide the name and let the client go through the DDR lookup process with the insecure resolver to get all the other information. I recognize that this costs some small number of round trips, but this is only on network association. It's not like a delay that, there shouldn't be a long delay. We're talking about round trips to the local resolver. So these round trips should be fast. And we're not talking about a delay that occurs on every page load or something. It's only at the time when you're connected to the network. It's also, I think, operationally preferable in many cases. For example, if I'm on a local network, let's say I'm on a CP-controlled network that actually hands out the ISP's DNS server in DHCP. If the ISP wants to make any alteration to the configuration of its DNS server, with DDR, all it has to do is update its own records, and that will naturally propagate. If that information is all being hard-coded into DHCP answers that are being handed out to users from customer devices, then they have to actually get all of those customer devices configuration updated first before they can change their resolver configuration. So it takes the details of resolver configuration, puts it farther and farther away from where the resolver is. Keeping those together has operational value, I think. If the latency is too much of a concern, then I would maybe optionally, for people who really care about this performance optimization, say that what you do is you take the entire DNS response that you would have gotten from DDR, all the different RR types, not just service B, but whatever, address records, whatever it is that you would have gotten through the DDR process, and you package it all up and you include it all inside the DHCP option. This is, to say this is everything you need to know. And then we don't have to define new formats. We don't have to worry about specs getting out of sync. And clients can be written to just take the same inputs from two different sources.
Thank you, Ben. Tommy Jensen, please.
So I'll point out that the additional RTTs are one concern. Another is security model. So as discussed in the draft, by putting all the information directly into DNR, a client can avoid making plain text DNS queries at all. And this is deemed as preferable for some networks as a trade-off, because as you say, using DDR means that the configuration can live closer to the resolver. On the other hand, using DNR allows the network to use protections for DHCP and RA, as discussed in the draft, that can protect against attacks on those technologies without necessarily needing to have something similar for DNS, which is the case today. Those technologies exist for DHCP RA, and so we protect against attacks on the DNS. Is another reason why.
Sorry, I'm going to just jump in and respond and say I don't. I'm talking about the DDR Section 5 discovery using resolver names mechanism. And that mechanism doesn't rely on any security properties of the insecure DNS. Because the resolver, the ultimate resolver, is authenticated back to the original name that was provided. Then it's a named resolver. So a DNS attacker can't do anything except deny you service, which they could do anyway.
Thank you. Good point.
Thank you, Tommy and Ben. Tommy Pauly, please.
All right. Yeah. So I totally agree with Ben on this one. I think having the name is sufficient to get a secure model. Of course, someone can create a denial of service attack here, and essentially the worst case you're going to be in, if you have RA guard or DHCP guard, is that the client would know that there is encrypted DNS available, and they would know that they are under attack. And then you can kind of handle that how you need to on the client, but you would never have a silent type of attack here. So I think just having the name would be sufficient. I also want to bring up that this overall style of approach has been brought up for how you put information about encrypted DNS over VPNs and things like IKE. And that was presented in the IPsec MA group. And largely that is following the pattern that's currently described here in DNR of sticking some of the information about the resolver, not all of it, directly in this case, IKE properties. That's one area where we really want to see kind of alignment here of wherever that document goes forward. And again, I think it'd be a lot cleaner to just have a name there and allow the rest of it to work. And when we're doing this, we need to think of the precedent we're setting. If we go with just a name that always points to a DNS record that has all the details, if we come up with a new DNS encryption type, so we already have DNS over quick, let's say we have DNS over Z, and DNS over Z, when that gets created and I want to start supporting that, it would be nice if I only have to update my resolver and then it can serve a DNS over Z SVCB record. If we go the other way, we're going to need to start updating DHCP servers, RA, IKE servers, and propagate this information into a lot of different places that have a lot of revs anytime we want to create a new protocol.
Thank you, Tommy. Ecker, please. Ecker, please.
Things to say, but you just didn't hear them. I think Tommy's making a good point here. I guess I would say, like, it seems to me that there are two coherent positions. One is, like, just have a name and then do DDR, basically. And the other is stuff all the information in DDR. I think what is problematic is the compromise position, the second half of this draft, the second half of the slide above, where it's like, here's some of the information, but not enough to actually do the job. That seems goofy. So I think we should, like, I'm happy if it was just, like, I think it would probably be better to have sort of stub everything in form, but like I can live with just the name.
Thank you. Nope. We lost Mohammed, it looks like, for feedback. But Tiru is here, so Tiru, please.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we started with just the name, but then when we saw the SVCB DNS draft that Ben had published, which was being used by DDR, was not mandating DNSSEC, then we started looking into other ways because of the possible external attacks that could basically modify the DNS response. But if that draft gets updated to say DNSSEC is mandatory, then probably that covers the scenario of any man-in-the-middle device modifying the responses, and all that this draft could publish is either the ADN or the entire stuff that the SVCB is giving. So IDN is much simpler, that we could just stick to that and we don't have to worry about new protocols of DNS coming up or new DNS records to resource request types coming in. So that would, I think if that change happens, probably then the security model remains intact, that even if there's a clear text DNS query that goes outside the home network or enterprise network, it's still being intact, and the only damage that an attacker could do is drop the packet and not modify it.
Okay, thank you, Tiru. Mohammed, did you have something else you want to comment on the prior feedback? You dropped for a moment there.
Yeah, I think I'm hearing, I would say, the comment we are receiving, and yeah, this is actually that's something that we had in the past, that we considered. We started only, I would say, with one option, and then we completed, as I would say, as the working group is progressing on the security assessment part. What we were hearing from the working group is that the working group is I would say is really sensitivity to the attacks, both the internal one and the I would say the external ones. So that's why we have added, I would say, this the list of IP addresses to be directly communicated by the DHCP, because we thought that at least we solve the external attack, and there is only the room from the internal one. So yeah, there is a trade-off there. So. And by the way, in the specification, we don't have any, I would say, any. It is not mandatory to return both the name and the IP address. This is really something which is really deployment specific. What we have so far in the document is it is recommended to return, I would say, the name, and then you can return directly the list of IP address. But if there is no list of IP addresses that are returned by the, I would say, by the server to the client, because this is, I would say, a decision by a local deployment, we have a discussion in one of the slides that you can, if you can just please move to slide number 8, please.
Well, Mohammed, actually, we're going to be, by the way, wrapping up the slides here. So this is going to be the last issue we're discussing before the end of the session.
Okay, that's fine. So this is basically the issue we are discussing. We are struggling with that. So if the current, as I mentioned, the current specification does not forbid, I would say, a deployment to return only a domain name. But then the question for us is what we will do with that domain name. Should we just, I would say, use the list of the legacy DNS server and then to establish your authenticated connection and go on, or you just rely I would say, the name to using the SVCB and then do the job. So I would say there is a lot of trade-offs there. There are some, I would say, some pro and cons. So yeah, we would like to hear from the working group, which I would say what the working group want us to have in the document. But for that to happen, we need more discussion and more inputs on that.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. DKG, please.
Thanks. So, sorry, I am worried I'm a bit confused here, but the distinction between just the name or full DNS records stuffed in, seems like there might be a distinction here if the DHCP server or the RA comes with multiple DNS resolver IP addresses. If you stick just the names in, then you have a problem with linking the name to which IP addresses are in use, right? Like maybe I offer 1.1.1.1 and 8.8.8.8, and I say the names are cloudflaredns.com and Google, dns.google. But you don't necessarily tie them to the right IP addresses. Whereas if you stuff DNS records, you actually do get the linkage between the IP address and the domain names. So just wanted to point out that linkage issue there for interpreting data.
Thank you. And last word for this set of slides right now will be Ben Schwartz, please.
Hi. So I wanted to try to answer Tiru's question about DNSSEC. So if you look at DDR section 5, you'll see that it specifies how to connect to a server using the DDR method when you start with an authentication name. And the key thing is that regardless of whether the DNS records that you're using along the way were valid or were in fact forged, when you finally reach the server, you do TLS and you do authenticated TLS and authenticate it back to its name. So it doesn't matter whether your DNS was secure up to that point. On the question of how to move IP addresses around, which has been touched a couple of times, the thing that makes sense to me is to say you can just take A and quad A records, and if you have if each named resolver is associated with a bag of records, then you can put some A and quad A records in that bag, and now we know the IP address. And if you don't have those hints, then you still don't have a linkage problem in my view, because CloudflareDNS.com and all the others are global names. They are resolvable, so you can just do A and quad A queries for those names and get the IP address.
Thank you. And I see, Tiru, that you jumped in. I'll note that we are officially over time right now, so please make it very brief.
Yeah, hey Ben, I got your point. There's no point that the TLS certificate authentication will fail if an attacker modifies it. But the bigger problem is, for example, if the client prefers to use, let's say, DOQ and it doesn't support others, and if the attacker strips the other to that protocol that the client supports, then the client will never be able to pick that. So there are threat vectors possible that if you don't use DNSSEC, then the client would be forced, because he realizes the server is supporting something like a new protocol, and it has no support for it, and it just gives up, right? So the attack modifying the DNS response need not be to point to a malicious server. It could be just to show some properties of the server that the client deems it's incapable of connecting to and just gives up, right?
Thank you, Tiru and Mohammed. We will continue in our next ADD session. And before I turn it over to Glenn for the wrap-up, I just want to say thank you very much to Chris Lemons for his heroic effort in keeping up with all this note-taking. Fantastic job. Tremendous help for us as a working group. Thank you. And just as a final wrap-up, next session will be on Thursday at 12 noon GMT. I've been told that there is no coffee and there are no cookies in the lobby currently. So if you need those things, you're on your own. Somehow we didn't get them provisioned in time. So thank you, and we'll see you on Thursday.